I always get the shakes before a drop. I've had the injections of course, and hypnotic preparation, and it stands to reason that I can't really be afraid. The ship's psychiatrist has checked my brainwave and asked me silly questions when I was asleep, and he tells me that this isn't fear. It isn't anything important. It's just like the trembling of an eager racehorse before the starting gate. I couldn't say about that. I've never been a racehorse, but the fact is, I got some bugs to kill. So at the end of my previous video, I actually had planned on doing something completely different, but then this thing happened. Which is a complete shock to me because usually I don't like shooters very much, and multiplayer games even less. That's pretty much why I never talk about the co-op features in the RPGs I review. I never played Helldivers 1 either, but watching the trailers with big explosion and clearly going after the Starship Trooper demographic, one of my favorite books, I decided to try it out, and my god, this is already Game of the Year material and we are in February. So what is Helldivers 2? Well, it is a 4-player co-op, which I thought was going to be a bad thing before I tried the game, and you are Helldivers, essentially the mobile infantry of the Federation with Super Earth as its center. Unlike the Starship Trooper movie, however, you actually drop on the planet in your goddamn pod. And as far as power armor is concerned, this is already something that is more or less announced with the addition of mechs. Just like the Hoven movie as well, it is very heavy on the propaganda, with the difference that the devs actually understand how to write parody, and this is extremely fun. From your training session with General Brash, with the wound simulator actually wounding your character critically, to the comments that you hear from the personnel aboard your ship, everything is completely over the top and I love it. And by the way, if you don't like the video and subscribe to the channel, you are absolutely civilian and shall be sent to re-education camp. Democratically, of course. So how is the game played exactly? Well, after you completed the training, you are given your own super destroyer. And everything is super in this universe. Super Earth, super citizen, super destroyer, super weapon.
I'm super! Thanks for asking!
Anyway. Now that you have your own ship, you can select a planet to go to and complete certain campaigns. A campaign is composed of multiple missions, from 1 to 3, depending on the difficulty tier that you have selected, which are separated in 3 tiers. The little twist in this game is that you have major orders. A major order is essentially something the community has to complete within the allocated time, which is typically a couple of weeks. So in the first 14 days of the launch, we had to liberate a couple planets from a bug infestation, which was completed. The new major order for this couple of weeks is to defend planets against the automatons, and this one is not going particularly well. And if you are wondering if Super Earth can be invaded itself, yes, it is actually possible for the enemies to reach it. So what do you do during the campaigns? Well, the missions are relatively varied. It can be as simple as just exterminating a certain number of enemies, it can be destroying some bug rolls or automaton factories, it can be about retrieving intel, or my personal favorite, launching an ICBM. To add to these primary objectives, you always have 2 to 4 secondaries, and they are about as varied. It can be about reactivating an artillery piece, it can be reactivating a radar tower, or it can be about destroying enemy structures which have an actual effect on the map, such as jamming your stratagems, preventing you from calling reinforcement or resupply for example, or limiting your view distance with a spore spewer. And for some of them, you actually have multiple ways of solving the problem, or actually you really have two. You can either do it the quote-unquote incorrect way by using the terminal and using the QTEs and doing things peacefully, or you can just drop a big ass bomb on top of it. The dev team has really mastered the old saying of there is nothing that cannot be solved with an unreasonable amount of high explosives. And that is really the core idea of this game. It does not matter how many legs the stuff in front of you has, it's your and your body's duty to drop on top of them and teach them the meaning of extreme prejudice. But if you think it's going to be easy, you are completely wrong. While the game has a lot of systems to allow you to do almost everything you want, including a fairly decent stealth system, surprisingly enough, the game can get extremely crazy extremely fast. because before dropping, the game might actually tell you where the areas of highest danger are, but that doesn't mean where you are dropping is free of enemies, not at all. In fact, in the higher difficulty modes, there are a lot of patrols pretty much everywhere on the map, and it is completely possible to drop, immediately have an enemy call for reinforcement, and all of a sudden you're fighting 2 Bio-Titans in the very beginning of the map. That's why in addition to your primary and secondary weapon, the game gives you some more options to deal with the threats that you're going to be confronted by. In the very beginning of the game, you get just the orbital strike, which is really a shot from your super destroyer, and a general purpose machine gun. As you keep playing the game, you're going to acquire some more weapons, like more assault rifles, submachine guns, pistols, or my current favorite, the fully automatic shotgun. And in this game, shotguns actually behave like in real life, meaning that you have some spread, but the weapon does not stop doing damage past 10 meters, and will still do decent damage at 100. You still have some more sci-fi weapons like laser or plasma, but the thing is this game has actually a pretty good penetration and armor system, which also models kinetic energy. Which means if you are using something like the laser cannon for example, the enemies are going to be taking a lot of damage, but they are not going to get stunned or just stop in their tracks. If you want that, you require an actual projectile, something with some oomph behind it, to speak scientifically. Something like the autocannon, which is just an oversized bore-sharp pistol with its cute little toggle lock. But how do you actually get all of these new toys? Well, it's not really complicated. You essentially have 3 types of currency. You have the medal war bonds, which allow you to buy stuff inside of the store. You have the premium currency in the form of super credits, because yes, this game technically has microtransactions, but I'm okay with it because it only gives you access to some cosmetic armors, for example, and some gimmicky weapons. And unlike what Ubisoft does, that kinda requires you to spend actual money if you want to be any kind of competitive in their games. And the last one that you have is samples. The purpose of the samples is to improve your ship that give you some bonus for your stratagems. And because I'm a spug, I'm actually forgetting about the last type of currency, which is the requisition points that actually allows you to buy new stratagems. The stratagems are kind of what you use when you want to deal with the bigger threats or large groups of enemies. And since using them just puts them on a cooldown for a little bit, the game really encourages you to use them as much as you possibly can. So you can get the support weapon, which can go from just a general purpose machine gun or an LMG. You can get rocket launchers, grenade launchers, railguns, autocannons. There's something for every single taste, though some of them are not as effective as they could be in higher difficulties. You can also get better versions for the orbital bombardment, meaning you can get 120mm shells, 380. You can get rail cannon, which is extremely useful to get rid of the really big and really armored threats. You can get a bunch of different sentries from mortars to Gatling guns to autocannons to rocket launchers, or you have my absolute favorite, the Eagle, which is a futuristic version of the A-10 Warthog. I absolutely love that thing because it carries multiple types of bombs, it has a very short cooldown between each of its strafing runs, and once it is finally done dropping all of its payload, it just needs to spend a few minutes at the Super Destroyer to rearm before being available again with all of its payload. And speaking of payload, there is something extremely important in this game. Friendly fire is always on. Always. For both the player and the enemies. Which means if you are playing in a group, it is extremely useful to have microphone to warn your buddies that they are jumping in the middle of an airstrike. And speaking of buddies and groups, it is true that the game had a lot of issue when it was first released. I suspect the main problem was coming from Sony and PlayStation Studio, who probably forced the dev to release a little bit too early when the game needed probably 3 weeks to a month more in the oven. The overwhelming majority of the bugs have been corrected, at least in terms of matchmaking and connection issues. However, the game is still a bit of a victim of its success. I believe the previous limit in terms of server capacity was 350,000 players for both PS5 and PC, and it has been increased recently to 450,000, which is still not enough. Considering the game has busted all of the records for concurrent players on Steam, I suspect it actually needs 600,000. Visually, everything in this game is pretty much a reference in some retro-futuristic kind of way. For example, the guns are very clearly following the Aliens tradition of taking real rifles and disguising them somehow. For example, the pump-action shotguns are Utash 15s, the Liberator is a Tavor 7, and the Penetrator is a Keltec RDB, very clearly. This continues on the planets, with some of them being extremely pretty and reminding me of Pandora from Avatar, The mushroom motes that are clearly from Alien's Covenant and also explode in a puff of smoke, and your Super Destroyer being very clearly the back of a StarCraft II Dreadnought, and the front is literally just the Sulaco rotated 90 degrees. When I say that everything in this game is either a reference or a parody of something else, I really do mean it, and I will not insult your intelligence by telling you what everything is. Regarding the enemy factions, it's very obvious that the automatons are inspired by Terminator, at least the base infantry dudes. If you look at the bigger ones, I believe they are more inspired by Warhammer 40k, especially when you are looking at Demon Engines and Hellbrutes, for example. When you're looking at the bugs, it is a little bit more eclectic. Some of it seems to be somewhat inspired by Starship Troopers, while others like the Bio-Titan are lifted straight from the Tyranids. And they look so good that I have absolutely no problem with that. There is supposed to be a third faction that we know from the previous game that is very much a parody of the Protoss, but considering the galactic map is essentially separated in 4 quadrants, with the western one being the automatons and the eastern one being the bugs, I would surmise that the third faction would take the north and probably a fourth faction would take the south. Personally, I would really like to see a parasite faction a little bit like Aliens. But in the meantime, you get to enjoy the various planets already in the game. While some of them are barren and not particularly interesting, I have to say, some like the jungle planets are absolutely gorgeous. And because there is a day and night cycle, there is nothing quite like watching the sunrise when you are in one of these jungle planets. And ironically, the training tips when you drop are telling you that you should spend at least 2.4 seconds enjoying the scenery. The armors are doing exactly the same thing. So far I've seen some reference to Cylons, I've seen references to Starship Troopers, and obviously the one that I'm wearing right now and that I use all the time is pretty clearly an Imperial Scout Trooper from Star Wars, just painted green. Something I really like in the animation department is that everything the characters do is done correctly. By this, I don't mean that the animation for crawling, walking, etc. look good. What I mean, for example, is if your character is in the middle of an animation reload, inserts a new magazine and an enemy comes a little bit too close, so you switch to your secondary to take it out, when you go back to your primary weapon, if it was empty and you just inserted the magazine, it will still show as empty, so your character needs to finish the animation and rack the charging handle. I know it doesn't sound like much, but for a gun nut like me, this is a detail that I really enjoy. The one thing that I find to complain about a little bit is that every single planet you go on is pretty barren. And I know the game has just started and the planets that we are on are pretty much just periphery. However, I would like to see something more urban or something more densely populated, because you don't see any civilians, or you actually see some of them if you are doing an extraction mission, but it's very few of them. On occasion on the automaton planets you can see, just like in Terminator, piles of bodies, but there is never any kind of urban centers or decently sized town for you to fight in, just like you would see for example in Battletech. Maybe these missions are just hidden currently behind story progression, but I can't help but think this is a little bit of a missed opportunity. On the audio front, everything about this game is a masterpiece. The voice acting is super cheesy, as it should for a game that's essentially a parody of Starship Troopers the book. The guns are all incredibly meaty, a little bit like Starship Troopers the movie, and the bombs sound increasingly destructive, especially if you drop them from the Eagle, where you have the sound of the plane also passing by. But where the game shines the most for me is ironically not on the weapons on the plane or the bombs. Just like Starship Trooper, I think the game developers understood that what made that movie was the soundtrack, and in this case there is a lot of inspiration that is taken from said movie. I'm just gonna play a few seconds of the Clendatu drop and then of the Helldivers theme. It's obviously very heavy on the brass, the horns and that sort of thing, and it sounds very heroic, which is exactly on point for this game. That's the music you hear every single time you execute a drop, and I'm not getting sick of it, at all in fact. For the writing, well, it's a multiplayer game, so there's not that much in there, but it is a parody of Starship Troopers the book, and is ironically closer to the source material than a movie, because in this one you actually get drop pods. To put it simply, you are the equivalent of the mobile infantry, in this case, a Helldiver. So after a hilarious training session that goes really hard on the cheese, you are sent immediately in cryo because Helldivers only are awakened when Super Earth actually needs them. Super Earth being what they call a managed democracy when you feel questioned and the computer votes for you, because can only lead to the safest elections ever, right? But anyway, when Verhoeven did not understand the book whatsoever, I think that studio actually does, and that's why it's a far better parody than anything the Dutch would have made. So while the Terran Federation in Starship Trooper, the book I mean, is essentially a libertarian utopia, the managed democracy of Super Earth is an incredibly violent dictatorship that does not even tolerate anybody reproducing without its authorization. Which is very ironically the definition of a democracy, the tyranny of the majority specifically. On the other side we have the bugs, which I'm not actually sure if they're supposed to be the same species or they are incredibly dimorphic if that's the case, but anyway it is a sentient hive mind. So beside them expanding way too much for the comfort of humans, what exactly does Super Earth want with them? Well, it turns out that when they die, they turn into oil. In this universe though, BP does not even bother to say sorry, and they just farm them to manageable level in order to exploit their bodies. For the automatons on the other end, well, it's essentially a cycle of them invading us, then us invading them, and just liberating the capital world of Cyberstan. But the thing is, these automatons are also rabid socialists, and as we all know, socialists are not humans, so extermination is the proper course of action. I'm not familiar with the lore of the third faction that is not even in the game at the moment, and I have also never played the original game, so I can't really speak to the accuracy or the retcons from the previous game. If you have followed the video so far, you know it's great. So go get your friends, get yourself some gear, and remember, it's not a war crime if it's done democratically.